The sun scorched the earth in Redemption Gulch, baking the ground until it cracked like shattered clay and stirring up red dust that stuck to every inch of exposed skin. Vincent entered town beneath the shimmering haze of midday heat, his figure rippling in the distance like a ghost. The creaking leather of his saddle and the far-off cry of cattle were the only sounds that tethered the scene to normalcy. But this wasn't a routine trip. He was here for the auction, that grim ritual of chance where misfortune changed hands as easily as cattle or tools. The air was thick with sweat, horse musk, and a tense kind of silence that spoke volumes. Vincent was no stranger to hard days and lonelier nights. The lines on his sunburned face and the calluses on his hands bore testament to a life carved out under the vast sky. He wasn't much for crowds, and he didn't waste time on idle talk. But today, his gaze caught on something unusual. Someone sitting alone in the far corner of the auction enclosure, a woman, barely more than a shadow. Her clothes were scorched, hanging in tatters, her body wrapped in soot and silence. She sat motionless, not defeated, but distant, as though the world around her had burned away with everything she'd once known. A murmured voice drifted from the crowd. Devil's Creek Fire. She's the only one made it out, though she looked broken at first glance. There was something unbroken in her stillness. Pride maybe, or a kind of quiet resistance that refused to be swallowed by tragedy. The auctioneer, wide-set and weathered, launched into his rhythmic chant, words rough and hurried. Bids came slowly, men hoping to snatch up cheap labor without looking too closely. The gavel hovered in the air. Then Vincent's voice rang out, clear and sure. $50. A hush fell over the gathering. Heads turned, eyebrows raised. That was too much for someone they saw as nothing but ashes and silence. Still, the gavel dropped. The deal was done. She walked toward him carefully, her steps uncertain. Midway, she stopped and lifted her face. Beneath the grime, her eyes found his eyes, the color of glacial water, striking against the soot. They were heavy with sorrow, yet in them flickered a strange, fragile fire. In that glance, something unspoken passed between them, not pity, not possession, but a shared recognition. This wasn't about charity. It was about something just beginning to take shape. He helped her into the wagon, and they set off toward his land beneath a sky melting into purples and golds. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was careful, like two strangers waiting to see if the stillness could one day become trust. Vincent studied her now and then as they rode, wondering who she'd been before the fire and who she might still be under all that ash. Life on the ranch settled into a quiet pattern. The land, with its wide stretches of nothingness, mirrored Vincent's own solitude. Sarah, he'd learned from the station master, worked with a quiet diligence, as though keeping busy held her grief at bay. She cleaned the house until it gleamed, cooked without fuss, and tended the animals with a gentle, practiced touch. But even as she settled in, the soot lingered on her skin, a cloak she hadn't yet shrugged off. Vincent understood. Some wounds prefer to stay hidden. Each morning, he rode out before dawn, pushing cattle across the dry fields, returning when the sky was streaked with orange. In the evenings, he'd sometimes catch her standing still, her gaze drifting toward the distant mountains like she was listening for a voice. She wasn't ready to forget. Then one dusk, after a long day marked by heat and strain, Vincent came home to find her by the wash basin. Her sleeves were pushed up, and she was slowly rinsing her face, fingers moving with deliberate care. He paused in the shadows, watching without meaning to. Struck by the moment, bit by bit, the soot disappeared. Beneath it, a different woman emerged, not just in appearance, but in presence. It wasn't just a face he saw, but a spirit beginning to reawaken, quietly, cautiously. A past burned away, a future not yet written. And as he stood there, watching her in the fading light, Vincent felt the first stirrings of something fragile and real taking root. The ash dissolved slowly, revealing skin that was pale and untouched. Beneath the soot, her cheekbones were finely shaped, and near her temple, just above her left brow, a faint tracery of old scars became visible, quiet remnants of a past she had endured. As the final streaks of gray faded, she turned to face him. Her eyes, now an arresting shade of clear blue, were no longer clouded. They held a calm steadiness, touch with vulnerability, but lit with an inner strength. The scars didn't scream of catastrophe, they whispered it. They hinted at flames and pain. But her face remained composed, her gaze unwavering. That night, with the scent of pine smoke curling softly through the modest kitchen, they shared a simple meal, hot venison stew, nothing extravagant, but filling. The silence between them had shifted. It no longer carried tension or uncertainty, but something more profound, a mutual recognition. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, worn from long stretches of silence. Her words came carefully, each one deliberate. She told him about a small cottage by a stream, of warmth and laughter, of a life once full of love. Then, with no pause for dramatics, she mentioned the fire, how it had devoured everything she held dear. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet, exhausted ache. Vincent sat and listened, offering no interruption. Her story resonated with him, echoing his own loneliness. But more than that, he found himself deeply moved by the quiet resilience in her. What had begun as a flicker between them during that bleak auction was now settling into something firmer, still fragile, but undeniably real. The vast silence that once haunted his land no longer felt as hollow. In the weeks that followed, something changed on the ranch, not just the routine, but the very air. The land itself seemed to shift, responding to this quiet companionship. The blistering heat of summer gave way to autumn's clarity. The cottonwoods near the creek flamed gold, and Sarah, no longer wrapped in ash and silence, began to come alive. In small, surprising ways, where once she moved with hesitation, she now stepped with purpose. She learned to ride, her posture stiff but determined. She patched torn shirts, fixed fence posts, and stood alongside him at the branding pen, unflinching, focused. Her presence was steadying, a new kind of constant in his life. The sky above, once a wide expanse of loneliness, now held promise. Their conversations grew deeper, wandering from mundane ranch work to fears and dreams long buried. Vincent spoke of his hopes for the herd, of ruined crops and cold nights, and the emptiness he had learned to live with. Sarah shared more of her past, not to gain sympathy, but to speak honestly. There was a grace in the way she carried her hardships, and a strength that quietly drew him closer. He no longer saw only the woman who'd emerged from the ashes. He saw someone shaped by hardship, still standing, still fierce. One afternoon, as they worked on a far fence line, the sky cracked open with thunder. Rain poured down in sheets, wind howling across the plains. The cattle panicked, charging wildly, fear in their eyes. Vincent felt helpless, caught between duty and dread. Then he felt her hand on his arm, strong, sure. Without hesitation, she sprang into action beside him, her wet hair clinging to her face, her clothes drenched, her movements sharp and efficient. Together, they drove the cattle back under control. When it was over, breathless and soaked through, he looked at her and saw her with complete clarity. She was not just someone fate had dropped into his life, not merely a survivor of tragedy. She was his equal, his partner, his anchor when the world threatened to pull him under. Whatever they had, once silent and uncertain, had now become something solid, enduring. But just as a new rhythm began to take hold on the ranch, a shadow crept in from the edges of her past. It began subtly, snatches of conversation overheard in Redemption Gulch. A stranger had arrived, asking questions. His name was Silas. A long scar ran down his left cheek, and his eyes carried a cold, unsettling intensity. He wasn't just passing through. He was searching. He asked about a fire, a lost family, a woman who had survived. Vincent heard the murmurs in the general store, the quiet that fell when he walked in. This man, Silas, wasn't a stranger to Sarah's story. He had been tied to her late husband, a man tangled in dark dealings that had left no one untouched. There was violence in Silas, worn like a second skin. And as Vincent rode back home beneath the heavy glare of the sun, a new kind of tension took root inside him. The past hadn't finished with them yet. Supplies lasted, but a quiet unease had begun to settle over the ranch. Sarah seemed more withdrawn with each passing day, her once steady presence now clouded by something Vincent couldn't name, until one hushed evening when she opened up. Her voice barely carried, Yet the weight of her words hit hard. Silas, a man with ties to her late husband's murky past, believed she knew the location of some hidden money. His belief had turned into obsession, and now he was circling back. The sense of dread that hung over them wasn't loud, but it was heavy like thunder you couldn't hear yet, only feel in your bones. It wasn't long before Silas showed up, striding onto their land with two men trailing him, men whose rough appearances said more than words ever could. He didn't waste time. He went straight for Sarah, his voice soaked in menace as he demanded what he was sure she had. His grin was hollow, his threats laced with cruel memories, and the way he spoke made it clear this wasn't about fairness, it was about control. He wanted her afraid. Vincent stayed still, but something fundamental shifted within him. His hand drifted near the grip of his old revolver, not in fear, not to intimidate, but because he had drawn a line. Sarah didn't waver either. Though her hands trembled, her spine didn't bend. She told Silas she had nothing for him, that she was done being haunted. The past had found her again, but she wasn't going to let it rule her anymore. Standing there, Vincent saw her more clearly than he ever had. He understood what it truly meant to stand by someone, to carry their scars as your own. He was scared any man would be, but beneath that fear, determination took root. Sarah looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw something stronger than fear, resolve. They had fought hard to find peace, and now that peace was on the line. Days passed. Then, under a wind that stirred the dust like a warning, Silas came back, this time with more men. The sun hung low behind them, casting warped shadows across the land. The world felt tight, braced for a clash. Vincent stood firm on the porch, his expression calm, though every muscle in his body was prepared for whatever would come next. He wasn't a gunfighter, but he was a man with something worth protecting. Sarah was there too. She didn't flinch or hide. Her stance told a story of courage discovered through hardship, and a faith in Vincent that needed no words. No one spoke. The tension buzzed like a wire stretched to thin. Silas stepped forward, fingers brushing the edge of his holster, eyes locked on Vincent. It felt like the air might shatter. And then, in the distance, HOOFBEATS. Two ranchers approached, neighbors, quiet men who had witnessed Silas's cruelty before and had chosen not to look away this time. They didn't need speeches or explanations, their presence alone was enough. Silas's confidence cracked, his men shifted, sensing the tide turning. Outnumbered, the threat no longer his to wield, Silas hesitated. He spat out a few half-hearted threats before turning back, dust kicking up as they rode off. The aftermath wasn't loud. It was soft relief, but also something sturdier. Vincent and Sarah stood in the fading wind, a little lighter, bonded by what they'd faced. What had just happened didn't destroy them. It proved them. The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in fierce oranges and deep violets. Vincent turned to her, but he didn't need to say anything. Her eyes, brimming but strong, answered everything he could have asked. A week later, they stood under the open sky, exchanging vows on the land they had defended together. It was simple, just the wind, a few close faces, and a love that didn't need dressing up. No fancy clothes, no practiced lines, just two people who had seen the worst and still reached for each other. Vincent, the man who thought he'd live his life alone, and Sarah, who had hidden so much behind those guarded blue eyes, had found something neither expected, a future, one built not on ease, but on truth, trust, and the kind of love that doesn't just survive fire but is forged in it.